I have cooked for hard men in cold places my whole life, and I learned early that the ones who notice the cook are almost never the dangerous ones. The dangerous ones look through you. You are the hands that put the bowl down and take the bowl away, and a man with killing in him does not waste his eyes on hands. So I had spent 61 winters being looked through, and I had made my peace with it, and that peace is the only reason any of this happened the way it did. Hollowmark Relay sat in the throat of the Greywind Pass like a stone caught in a man's windpipe. 3 buildings and a well that froze 9 months of the year, and a road that climbed up out of the lowlands, crossed our yard and dropped away again into country no sane man went into without a writ and an armed escort. We were the last warm thing before the high border. Caravans stopped with us. Couriers stopped with us. Soldiers stopped with us, going up grim and coming back down grimmer, fewer of them than had gone, and I fed them all. I cooked in a long, low room with a hearth at one end and a row of tall windows down the south wall, and in the mornings the light came through those windows white off the snowfields and lay across my tables like spilled milk. I have stood in finer kitchens. I have never stood in one with better light. A man can forgive a great deal of cold for light like that. The garrison was 9 soldiers and a sergeant, plus the postmaster and his clerk, plus me and my pot. The soldiers were border men, which is to say they were tired in a way that had stopped being about sleep. They had been up the pass and seen what the pass led to. None of them spoke much of it, but I served them, and you learn a man's heart by what he leaves on the plate. These men left nothing. They ate like the food might be taken from them. That is a soldier who has been somewhere bad. What was up the pass past the high border was the ashen host. I had never seen them. Almost no one living had seen them and come back able to say so. They were the war drakes of the cold empire beyond the mountains, not the small fire lizards a frontier farmer might curse over a burned barn, but the true kind, the old kind, big as a barge and clad in scale like slate, with wings that could put a whole valley into shadow. The empire kept them the way other empires keep cavalry. When a border lord forgot his place, the host came over the mountains in the dark, and there was no border lord in the morning, and no hall, and no village under the hall, and the snow came down soft on the black ground, and that was the end of it. The soldiers had been sent up to mark our line and remind the empire it ran here and no farther. They had marked it. The host had let them mark it, the way a big dog lets a child shout. Then the host had reminded them in turn that the line meant nothing, and the men had come back down the pass with 2 fewer than they'd left with, and a silence that no broth of mine could thaw. That was the autumn. By the deep of winter the men had settled into a grim, watchful waiting, and I had settled back into being looked through, and the snow came down, and one night a storm came up out of the north that put its shoulder against Hollowmark and tried to push us off the mountain. I was the only one who heard the thing fall. I sleep poorly, as old men do, and on storm nights I do not really sleep at all, only lie in the dark behind the hearth and listen to the wind work at the chinking. So when something came down hard against the woodpile out past the kitchen door, not the wind's kind of sound, a heavier sound, a meat-and-bone sound, I was the only soul at Hollowmark awake to wonder at it. I should have woken the sergeant. Any sensible man would have woken the sergeant. Instead, I put on my coat and my boots and took the lantern and went out into the storm, because I have never in my life been able to leave a thing lying in the cold without going to see what it was. The wind nearly took the lantern. The snow came sideways and stung. I got the door of the woodshed lee at my back and held the light up, and the light fell on the gray. I did not understand it at first. It was too big to understand all at once. It was a long heaped shape half drifted over with snow, ash-gray and ridged, and where the snow had not yet covered it there were scales, each one the size of my palm, dull as old pewter, rising and falling barely with breath. One wing was flung out crooked across the woodpile at an angle a wing should never make. The other was folded wrong against its side. There was a head at the near end of it, long and narrow and horned, lying flat in the snow, and the eye in that head was open a slit, and the slit of eye was looking at me. A war drake. A young one. I knew that much even then, even stunned, because the full-grown kind could not have fit in our whole yard, and this thing, big as it was, big as a plow ox, was a half-grown thing. A juvenile. Out of the host. Out of the country beyond the high border, somehow over the mountains and down the pass in a storm, and now lying in my woodpile dying. The sensible thing, the only sensible thing, was to go and wake the sergeant. 9 soldiers and a sergeant, and one half-dead enemy drake in the yard, and the spears would settle it, and in the morning we would have a story to tell and a hide to sell, and we would have struck one small blow against the host that had taken 2 of our own up the pass. I crouched down in the snow instead, and I looked at the slit of eye looking at me, and I saw that the young drake was afraid. I do not know how to make a man who has not seen it understand. We are taught that the alien is a thing without our feelings, that the dragon is appetite and fury and nothing soft underneath, and maybe for the great ones of the host that is even true. But this was a hurt young creature lying broken in a storm, and I have seen fear in the faces of enough living things to know it when it looks back at me, and there was fear in that slit of eye. Not rage, not threat. The animal, helpless, dignified terror of a thing that knows it is dying, and knows it is alone. I have served hard men my whole life. I have learned to be looked through, but I have never once in my life been able to leave a thing lying in the cold. "All right," I said to it over the wind. "All right now, all right." It did not understand my words. Of course it did not. But a voice is a voice, and a low, steady voice has a meaning under the words that crosses every border there is, and the slit of eye held on me, and the long head did not so much as try to lift. It had no fight left to make. It only watched me and waited to see which kind of man I was. I went back inside, and I did not wake the sergeant. I banked the hearth up hot, and I dragged my own pallet, and 3 of the soldiers' spare blankets out into the woodshed lee. And I built a kind of windbreak of split logs against the worst of the gale. I could no more move that drake than I could move the mountain, so I would have to bring the warmth to it. I boiled water and carried it out in the big copper and poured it steaming over rags and packed the rags along its flank under the blankets, and I did that again, and again, while the storm screamed, until the gray scales were warm to the touch instead of cold as the snow they lay in. Then there was the matter of feeding it, and there I will admit I did not know what I was doing and worked it out the only way a cook knows how, which is by trying. It would not take meat. I held a strip of salt pork to the long jaws and it turned its head a half-inch away, too sick to eat, the way a fevered child turns from food. So I did what I would do for a fevered child. I made broth. I had a kettle of bones going anyway, as I always did, and I skimmed it and salted it light and let it cool to blood warm, and I brought it out in a wooden bucket and held it under the narrow nose. The slit of eye opened a little wider. The long tongue, gray and forked, came out and touched the broth and withdrew and came out again. And then the young drake drank, slow and shaking and spilling half of it down its jaw into the snow, but it drank the whole bucket and a second bucket after, and when it was done it laid its head back down in the warm rags and the slit of eye closed, and the breath under the gray scales came a little deeper than before. I sat in the woodshed lee with my back to the logs and the storm howling over the top of us, and I watched it breathe until the gray light came up in the east. And somewhere in there I understood, in the plain, quiet way an old man understands things, that I had made a decision I could not take back. I told the others it was a sick-pack mule. It is a measure of how little anyone at Hollowmark looked at me, that this held for 9 days. The woodshed was mine, the cook's domain. No soldier goes into the cook's woodshed in the dead of a frontier winter. It is full of the cook's mysteries and the cook's smell, and there is nothing in it a soldier wants. I kept the door shut and I kept the drake quiet, and it was quiet. That was the strange grace of it, as if it understood from the first that its life now depended on stillness. When the men were about, it lay still as the logs. It was only with me, in the long cold hours after the evening meal when the others had gone to their bunks, that it would lift its head and watch me work, and once or twice make a low sound deep in its chest. Not a roar, nothing like a roar, a sound more like the noise a cat makes that has decided you are not going to hurt it. I learned its hurts by tending them. The shattered wing was the worst. The long bone of it, the spar, I called it in my head, the way you'd call the long bone of a tent, was snapped clean a third of the way out, and the membrane was torn, and the whole limb hung wrong and would not fold. I am no bone setter, but I have splinted men in my time, on roads where the nearest surgeon was a week of dying away, and a bone is a bone. I waited until the fever broke enough that it could bear my hands on it, and then I talked to it low the whole while. All right now, all right, easy, and I drew the spar straight. It screamed once, a short awful sound I felt in my teeth, and then it held still and let me, which I have thought about many times since, that a wild war drake of the host held still under an old man's hands because the old man's voice told it to. And I bound the spar to 2 seasoned ash staves with strips of harness leather. And I splinted that wing the way you'd splint an arm, and the young drake lay panting and let me. And when it was done, it put its head down across my boots and stayed there a long time. After that there was no more pretending, not to myself. I was not minding a sick mule. I was keeping a thing alive that the whole rest of the world would want dead, and I was keeping it alive because it had looked at me afraid and I could not do otherwise. I do not dress it up grander than it was. It was the plainest decision a man ever made. It was the decision a man makes who cannot leave a thing in the cold. It bore a mark. I found it on the 4th day when I was cleaning the gray scale of the splinted shoulder with warm water and a rag, the way you clean a wound to keep the rot out. There, set into the scale over the great muscle of the shoulder where a wing roots into a body, was a pattern, not a scar, not a brand, but a thing grown into the very scale, a sigil of paler gray, a closed ring with 3 bars across it. I did not know what it meant. I knew that it meant something. You do not grow a clean device like that into your hide by accident. This was no stray, no runt cast out by a wild brood. This young drake belonged to someone, and belonged to them in the way that a signet ring belongs to a house. I cleaned the mark gently, and I covered it back over with the blanket, and I did not let myself think too hard about whose house keeps its young marked with a closed ring and 3 bars. The men started to feel it before they understood it. That is the way of dread. The sergeant, Vels, a square gray man who had been up the pass and lost his 2, started standing in the yard at dusk looking north, the way a farmer looks at a sky that has turned wrong. Cold's holding, he'd say, which was a soldier's way of saying something he could not name was coming, and he'd look north, and the soldiers caught it from him, and a fear settled over Hollowmark with no cause that any of them could point to. There was a cause. I had it shut in my woodshed. On the 7th night, I went out after the meal, and the young drake was standing. Not strong, trembling on its 4 legs with the splinted wing held out crooked, and its head low but standing, filling half the shed with itself, taller at the shoulder now than I was, and when I came in with the broth bucket it turned that long horned head to me, and the eyes gold I could see now in the lantern, gold ringed with a darker amber, deep old eyes. The eyes found me, and there was nothing of the slit of dying terror in them any more. There was something else. I have kept dogs. I have kept horses I loved. I had never in my life been looked at by anything the way that young drake looked at me in the woodshed, as though I were a fixed star it had decided to steer by. It dipped its head, slow, deliberate, down and down, until the long jaw nearly touched the floor and the horned brow was below my chest, and it held there. I did not know the gesture. I knew it was a gesture. I put my old hand flat on the warm gray scale between its eyes, because that seemed to be what was wanted, and the breath went out of it long and easy, and we stood like that, the broth going cold in the bucket, the white moon-snow light coming in at the high window. An old cook and an enemy's son, neither of us belonging anywhere in the wide world half so much as we belonged, in that moment, to the quiet of that shed. Then I heard Vels in the yard, calling the watch in early, his voice gone tight, and I heard the soldiers' boots, and under all of it, far off and high and getting nearer, I heard the sound that had been coming all along. Wings, many wings. A sound like a great slow heartbeat made of leather and wind, coming down out of the north, coming down the throat of the Greywind Pass, coming for what was in my shed. The Ashen host had found the trail of their lost young, and they had come. I will not pretend the next part was anything but terror. They came out of the last of the day's light with the dusk behind them, and there were so many that the men on the wall did not raise the alarm so much as stop speaking all at once, which is a worse sound than any horn. I came out of the shed into the yard and looked up, and the sky over Hollowmark was full of drakes, not the half-grown kind, the full kind, the host. They came down in slow circles, wing over wing, each one of them a moving piece of the mountain, scale like slate, eyes like coals banked low, and the wind off their wings rolled across the yard and put out 2 of the wall torches and bowed the smoke of my own chimney flat to the ground. The men stood at the wall with their spears and did not lift them, because there is no lifting a spear against that, and a man knows it in his belly the moment he sees it, the way he knows not to spit into a flood. They settled on the wall and on the well-house roof, and on the ridge above the road, and on the frozen field, and the snow groaned under the weight of them. 300, I learned later. 300 wardrakes of the Ashen host stood around Hollowmark Relay in the blue dusk, and the whole of that great host was silent, and the silence was the most frightening thing I have ever stood inside of. One came down into the yard itself. It was the largest. I did not have to be told it was the lord of them. You do not have to be told which is the king when the king walks in. It came down slow and folded its wings, and even folded it stood higher than the kitchen roof, and the closed-ring and 3-bar sigil was set into the scale of its shoulder, grown there pale against the slate, the very mark I had cleaned on the young one in my shed. The Drake Lord, sire of the thing I had been keeping warm with broth and harness leather. Its great head came down on the long neck until one banked coal eye, taller than my whole body, was level with the men at the wall, and it looked at them, and it drew a breath that I swear I felt pull at my coat, and I understood with a cold certainty that I was about to watch every soul at Hollowmark die, and the buildings burn, and the snow come down soft on the black ground, the way it always did when the host remembered a border to a people who had forgotten their place. It thought we had taken its young. It thought we had killed it, or caged it, or worse. It had followed the broken trail of a lost half-grown son down out of the high country expecting to find a hide nailed to our wall, and it had come to do to us what the host does, and the men knew it, and they stood at the wall and waited to die for a thing they did not even know they were guilty of. So I did the only thing an old cook knows how to do. I went and got the boy. I will not tell you I was brave. I was so frightened my hands would barely work the latch. But the splinted young one was mine to answer for, and the men were going to burn for my secret. And there is a thing in a man, even an old look-through man, that will not let others pay his debt for him. I got the shed door open, and I got my shoulder under the young Drake's good side the way I'd done a dozen times helping it to stand. And I said, "All right now, all right. Come on, easy." And that brave half-grown thing came out of the shed leaning on me, hobbling on its 4 legs with its splinted wing held crooked in its leather staves and its head up, out into the yard, into the blue dusk, in front of 300 wardrakes of the host and the great banked coal eye of its own sire. The Drake Lord saw its son. The breath it had drawn to burn us went out of it in a sound I have no word for, not a roar, the opposite of a roar, a long broken rush of air, the sound a father makes who has spent days believing a thing and is in one instant unmade of the belief. The great head came down off the height of the kitchen roof, down to the snow of the yard, down to the level of its hobbling splinted son. And the young one let go of my shoulder and went to it, 3 limping steps across the trampled snow, and laid its horned brow against the vast horned brow of its sire. And the 2 of them stood there in the falling dark, breathing each other in, and not one of the 300 made a sound. Then the Drake Lord lifted its head and looked at me. I have been looked at by hard men my whole life, and looked through by harder ones, and I had thought I knew every kind of look there was. I did not know this one. The great eye, taller than I stood, banked coal gone soft, came down close to me, close enough that the heat of it warmed my face in the freezing dark, close enough that I could have laid my hand on the slate of its cheek the way I'd laid my hand on its son, and it looked at me, an old broken-down cook standing in the snow in a grease-stained coat, and it saw me. Not through me. It saw the splint of ashwood and harness leather. It saw the blankets. It saw the broth bucket I still, God help me, had in my other hand. It saw, in the way that the great ones see, the whole 9 days of it, every cold hour, the warm rags and the straightened spar and the low voice in the dark saying all right now to a dying enemy's child. And it understood what I was and what I had done. And it understood that I had done it for nothing, for no payment, no hope of reward, in a world where the sensible thing was the spear and the hide on the wall, and that I had done it because I could not leave a thing in the cold. It did not kneel to me. I want to be plain about that, because afterward the soldiers told it that way, and the couriers carried the story down the pass and told it that way, that the whole host bowed to the cook of Hollowmark. But it did not happen so, and the truth is better than the story. What the Drake Lord did was lower its great head until the long jaw rested in the snow at my feet, and breathe out slow, a long warm breath that rolled over me and over the yard and into the open kitchen door, a breath that smelled of stone and storm and something older than the mountains, and in that warmth, that I felt go right through my old cold bones, I understood that I was being given a thing the host gives almost no one and certainly no human man. I was being given the hearth. I was being claimed as warmthkin. The breath was the saying of it. There were no words and there did not need to be any. A low, warm breath in the cold has a meaning under it that crosses every border there is. Behind it in the dusk, the 300 made their sound at last. Not a roar, never a roar, but a long, low rolling note out of 300 chests at once. The sound the host makes for its own. The sound that says this one is ours. Do not touch this one is kept. The wall torches guttered in it. The men at the wall, who had stood waiting to die, stood instead with their spears lowered and their mouths open, looking at the cook they had looked through for a winter, hearing 300 wardrakes name him kin. They did not stay. The host does not stay among men. That is not its way. In the last of the light the Drake Lord raised its head and the young one turned to me one more time, the gold eyes finding me the way they had found me in the shed, the fixed star, and it pressed its splinted side against me a moment, careful of the staves, and made the cat sound, the I have decided you will not hurt me sound, the sound it had made on the second night, and then it went to its sire. The great wings opened across the whole of the dark sky. The wind of 300 drakes taking the air at once flattened the snow and slammed the kitchen door and tore the breath out of the men at the wall. And then they were gone, up the throat of the Greywind Pass, up into the high cold country beyond the border, a slow leather heartbeat fatting into the north, and Hollowmark stood untouched in the dark with every soul in it alive. The splint, when they found it later, was left behind in the trampled snow of the yard. The young one had slipped it off cleanly somewhere in the dark, ashwood and harness leather, the wing healed enough at last to fold. I kept it. I keep it still. Of all the things a man might keep, I kept the 2 cheap staves and the strips of old harness, because they are the truest thing I have ever made. The men did not look through me after that. That is a small thing, and I would be lying if I said it was the thing that mattered, but I will not pretend it was nothing to be seen, at 61, after a lifetime of being the hands that bring the bowl and take it away. Sergeant Vels came to me the next morning while I was making the porridge and stood a while saying nothing, and then he said, "You knew, the whole time. You knew what was in the shed," and I said yes, and he said, "If you told us we'd have killed it, and then last night they'd have burned us all, every man, and never known why." And I said yes, and he stood a while longer, and then he said the thing I have carried with me ever since, the thing that was worth more to me than the breath of the Drake Lord. He said, "You kept us alive by being kinder than the rest of us. I'll not forget that a man can do that." There is a mark on Hollowmark's gate now, cut by my own hand at the postmaster's asking, into the lintel where every caravan and courier passes under it, a closed ring with 3 bars across. The host put it nowhere. I put it there. But the couriers who go up the high border tell me it is known up there all the same, that there is a relay in the throat of the grey wind where the ashen host does not come for blood, a place under the closed ring where the cold empire's drakes will not burn, because once, in a storm, the cook of that place could not leave a thing lying in the cold. I am an old man and I will not see many more winters. I cook in the long low room with the tall windows, and in the mornings the white light comes off the snowfields and lies across my tables like spilled milk, and on the clear nights sometimes, far up the pass, I hear it, a slow leather heartbeat high in the dark, circling once twice over Hollowmark and then away north again. I never go out to look. I do not need to look. I put another stick on the hearth, and I set the broth to warm out of an old habit my hands will not give up, and I say it into the dark, low and steady, the way I said it to a dying thing in a woodshed once, the only words I have ever had that were worth anything at all. All right now, I say, all right, you are not in the cold, not here, never here.